Good morning, good afternoon, or indeed good evening. We are live. We're going to be doing, which is fantastic, the final part of MIS. It's EQ4 8B.12, A, B, and C. So that is what we're going to be trying to aim to cover as we go through this particular presentation. So there are consequences of disunity within nations. That is the kind of overall idea. And when you are thinking what type of question can be asked, it's always good to bear in mind what is the wording of the overall section. So we're thinking about what are the consequences of disunity within nations. A little bit like the last section that we were just finishing off in your pack. There are challenges to national identity. So it shows you, you're going to have to understand what are the challenges to national identity in that previous one. Now we're thinking about kind of what is the consequences of disunity within nations? What's happening? We're going to be addressing that. There's consequences and things happen, and that's what we want to be looking at in this particular presentation. Now, the former governor of the Bank of England, this was an interesting statement from him, and it fills in with our spec very well, which is it brings up and it links in the previous part of the spec with this final section, which is effectively we've got this growing sense of isolation or detachment among people within countries, whether it be developed or emerging nations, who feel they're not part of this, they're not benefiting from globalization. Maybe that's where a stronger sense of nationalism comes from. And we'll talk about what that might lead to in the most extreme cases. Does it lead to a call for independence? Coming up in a second. So for many, it's this loss of trust in the leaders. It's the political issues that are arising from this tension. It's, well, we're not benefiting from globalization. In some countries, you might be arguing, hold on, why are the political elite or a small group of elite getting wealthier and wealthier? Maybe we need to take back control. Maybe people don't like the TNCs that are maybe increasing inequality rather than helping. So we're going to try and think a little bit about this. Now, I mentioned a few points there where you would have heard me say there, nationalism going to a certain point may lead to certain types of movement. And that's where you'll probably know where I'm going with this already, but all these yellow countries, or highlighted yellow, not countries, areas, I should say, a lot of them. They are effectively areas where we have an independence movement away from the nation state itself. Now, what's causing these nationalistic movements? There is disunity within the country. Something's making people not happy with the way things have went. It might be the differences in language and culture are just too great that they feel, I don't feel part of who is governing us. Maybe they feel isolated. You hear, if you're far away from the capital, which actually you could argue physically your location is far, you're thinking you're in a peripheral area, but actually this doesn't always have to be physical, but a sense of alienation from central government. And the reason why that last point is potentially different is because, yes, that could be physical as well, but it could also be that maybe you're an ethnic group that isn't in power or you feel isn't represented. Maybe if you're an indigenous group. In fact, we've spoke about in the past the First Nations of Canada or indigenous groups in Brazil, and we'll come and talk about some of those later too. Few key terms here that I am going to be discussing. I think if you're doing a question on this, whether it be an 8 marker or a slightly longer one, you want to be trying to use some of this language. And the one we're going to use when we talk about these independence movements in a second is devolution. Maybe when some powers are given by central government to a local or regional administration. And I'm thinking, particularly in the Scottish example, with the Scottish Parliament has certain powers, and I'll come back and talk about that as well in a second. The idea of autonomous, that you have freedom to govern yourself and your own affairs, that is quite significant. Pluralistic, I've put at the bottom there. The idea is relating to or advocating a system in which two or more states, groups, principles, sources of authority coexist. I'll talk a little bit about that later too, but I guess my main point here is, can you use the language here that you see on the left, because it's good geographical terminology. Maybe you want to pause and get this into your notes. Separatism, the idea that you wish to be free from that country, you wish to withdraw from the larger political entity, the idea of succession. Now, here's one of our examples, which I think you should be getting down into your notes. What does disunity lead to? Well, a growing sense of nationalistic separatist movements, and often you begin to value your kind of local culture, your language, the things that you feel you are more part of, you identify more as your own. And that's where you might have noticed this flag if you've been to Barcelona in the past. I know that you often see them the times that I've managed to visit. You see that particular flag more than you'll see the Spanish flag. People proudly hang it from their apartments. Now, Catalonia as a region, it's 7.5 million or thereabouts, and they have a very distinctive language, very distinctive culture. And they identify as Catalans rather than Spanish. They have very strong views about independence. I'll come and give you a very up-to-date version on that in a second that gives you that top-level wow factor on this topic in a second. But as you can see from that graph before, there is a significant people who feel that, yes, they would be like that they're excluded from the European Union. They'd like to be part of the European Union, yes, but separate from Spain. Now, where are we on this? There's a historical context here that I don't want you to learn off by heart. But the interesting point, you might remember hearing about this, but in 2017, there was an unofficial and what was called an illegal independence referendum, where they basically just held a referendum to try and get separate from Spain and declare their independence. And Madrid got very, very angry, imposed direct rule on them after this. And then in 2019, they take to the street because many of the Catalan leaders were put into jail over that failed independence movement in 2017. Now, the reason why that most recent context is interesting is because this is taking us up to date, which is the current leader of Spain, Pedro Sanchez. He agreed at the end of 2023 what's been referred to as the Catalan amnesty deal. Effectively, his Spanish Socialist Workers' Party didn't secure enough votes to get straight into power in the Spanish Congress. So they created this controversial amnesty plan, which was kind of allowing them to team up with the pro-Catalan independence movement, as in the party, and effectively get back into power. So they almost kind of done a bit of a deal with them in order to make sure that the socialists got back into power. But what does the amnesty deal look like? Well, remember I said in that previous timeline there that, so many officials were arrested and many people were given sentences that were pretty bad. However, this deal includes 309 people who either facing or did face criminal lawsuits, including 73 police officers, basically letting them away without trials, or if they had a trial, it was being squashed. And this takes us right up to right now, March 24. And, imagine you could put in a little bit of level 4 wow that you're right up to date with this topic. And that is, there's some local elections going on in the region soon. But this is the current Catalan leader who agreed with, in that previous slide, agreed with Sanchez and his Socialist Party. But this is March 24. He says that there's a new stage in the quest for independence after this amnesty vote. So basically that law got passed. And the amnesty deal is standing up. Originally announced end of 2023. This is March 24. And he said, this is the Catalan leader, I think Catalonia is looking forwards now. And it's looking forwards so it can open a new stage following the amnesty. Aragonés said that new stage needs to be based on bringing about a jointly agreed referendum, because last time they went forward with the referendum without getting the backing of Madrid, which is why it all kicked off and was crazy. So now he's saying, well, hold on, we've done a bit of an agreement with them to help them get back into power. This is the Socialist Party. It looks like we could now try and agree an official referendum. So this disunity is still going on. The Catalan people feel that they want to be independent, away from Madrid, stand up for themselves. They are not benefiting from what Madrid is. They want to be their own people, and that looks like politically they're moving further ahead with that now. And then the other example is, and it's obviously one that's close to my heart. But there was a Scottish independence referendum in 2014. And I'll put any YouTube links that I put in this video in the description so you can watch them independently. So what is Scottish independence? Well, there is the referendum result. It was, should Scotland be independent from the rest of the United Kingdom? And the turnout was 84%. Really interesting. I'm Scottish, as you can tell and as you know, but I wasn't allowed a vote. You had to be living in an address in Scotland on the night of the election, and that meant I didn't get a vote, which was interesting because a lot of people said SNP managed to work out, a way of ensuring those who they thought might not want this. SNP are the Scottish Nationalist Party, and I'll come back and talk a bit more about them in a second. But anyway, turnout 84%. The yes vote 44%. Better Together 55%. Very close vote in the end. But what powers does Scotland already have? The Scottish Parliament already has powers over schools in Scotland, the NHS, university and colleges, hence the free university education to Scottish people. And the NHS, interestingly enough, Scotland gives free prescriptions to everybody, whereas we don't have that down here in England. Now, what's really interesting is the SNP, when it was run by Nicola Sturgeon. Yes, they just lost the vote by a very small amount, which originally was agreed upon by David Cameron, the current Foreign Secretary as I speak, who was in charge of UK at the time. Now, here's the interesting bit at the bottom here. Many people are pondering, should SNP have said they want another referendum, because since that referendum in 2014, there was then the Brexit vote. And actually, 62% of Scots voted to stay in the European Union. Now, that's interesting, because Scotland as a nation did not want to leave the European Union. So their argument is, well, actually, that Scotland as a nation had no ability to stay in the European Union, despite the fact they didn't vote to go out, because it was, again, that was the overall vote went the way of leaving. So many people say that Brexit strengthened the independence vote. However, the new independence referendum that followed the UK leaving the EU, Sturgeon was trying to get momentum from that, and the SNP were really pushing for that. But in the last year or so, the SNP, Sturgeon's stepped down, and the S&P are currently in decline, actually, as we speak in 2024. You can see their popularity has dropped. This is the latest I could get. This is pretty much from, let me see these figures. I think it's from the end of March. No, so the 10th to 11th of March. This is a poll that was carried out 2024. So this is very recent. You can see going back to February 23 when Nicola Sturgeon resigned. You can see that kind of slight, since Sturgeon declined, you've got that decline in SNP voting, which you can see was over 40% now, actually equal with Labour, who seem to have grown in popularity hugely, just like they have in the United Kingdom as a whole. But more interestingly, how important is, what's the sense of disunity now? Yes, there was a spike after Brexit. Yes, there was a big push after the closeness of the previous referendum. But if you look at what's happening in the UK now in 2024, where does Scottish independence rank as important issues for the 2024 election, whenever that may be? At the time of this recording, we don't know. But if you look, it's actually the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th most important issue for Scottish people. And that's interesting, isn't it? It's no longer right up there at the very top. So maybe you could argue, because of what's went on in the economy over the last few years, cost of living, maybe people have other issues, like, as you can see, the economy there. People are very worried about that. They're worried about the NHS and other issues that are not necessarily interesting. The environment and education is now above Scottish independence. So that's really up to date. That's pretty much 2024. And will there be Indy 2, as in an independence referendum 2? Time will tell. But there's certainly disunity when you look at the original vote. And maybe that's because Scottish people feel that they haven't benefited from that kind of the strength of the economy around London and the southeast. That's globalization. That you could argue with. Think of London, as we've spoke about in this course, a real global hub of the best banking, the best financial services, people from all around the world going there. You can see why maybe that's the consequences of this globalization, is the rise of nationalism in Scotland. It's a pretty compelling and great argument for you to get down in your notes. But what about kind of rising tensions in emerging nations then? Because often in emerging nations, we can see the tensions of those who are getting a lot and those who are not getting much. It's exacerbated by the fact that there often is such uneven distribution of the benefits. That's often seen in emerging nations a little bit more, and often it can be shown in through ethnicity, gender, religion, definitely internal. You can see the differences, and that causes tension and disunity. You could argue that's because not everyone has benefited from globalization equally. It creates the tensions within countries. I'm going to focus on the BRICS, but other emerging nations too, who maybe their GDP has went up huge, but they're grappling now with consequences because not everybody has benefited from that rise of GDP. Now, on the Google Slides version, I will share with you later so that you can extract things from this as well. But that top right-hand corner should be a video of me going from the very bottom there in the motorbike, the little motorbike, right up into Rocinha, which is where you see here. And that's a really interesting one, because I think Brazil is a very interesting example here, where we see not everyone has benefited from globalization, and certainly there is division between the haves and the have-nots. The fact that some people are becoming very wealthy out of Brazil's resources. There's also political tensions, and I think that's the important thing. The disunity often comes from political issues, mismanagement, corruption, as well as just the general GDP improvements that globalization has caused. Now, if we go back to 2016, a lot of Brazilians felt that the cost of hosting the 2016 Olympics, when the country, many people were struggling, there was a recession, there was lots of corruption scandals with the then leaders, and there was also a health crisis, and it's worth looking up the Zika virus. But what's really interesting is when you drive into Rocinha, which again you'll see on the video, further down the bottom, right at the start of it, it's effectively what is referred to as a favela, large kind of informal settlement. And it's actually incredibly safe, although I'm standing over the Y that says my hood. It's actually very, very safe, largely because the government don't control it here. It's controlled by one of the very powerful drug gangs, and that's actually why it's very safe, because they don't want trouble. They don't want the police to come in. So they say you're not going to be a victim of crime there. Obviously, if there's some sort of shooting or something, that's very different. Anyway, so what they did was they redeveloped, particularly down the bottom, and they tried to build some flats, and they tarmacked a road into Rocinha. And that was like, where they were driving the dignitaries and the special people in to show them the progress that has been made. There's a lot of resentment about that. And my guide, when I was going through here, was able to say, look at these flats. People didn't like it because the kind of traditional style flats they were trying to build for many people and move them into, the loss of community, the way that they live in the favelas at the moment, with the houses on top of each other, side by side. There's a real sense of community and togetherness that actually the kind of block flat approach really didn't go down well at all. Bolsonaro was also elected in 2019. He's not in power anymore. He was just voted out last year by Lula, who I'll talk about again in a second. But he divided Brazilian society on a number of his anti-LGBT rights. He also supported deforestation. Again, it was felt that certain wealthy elites were benefiting from the country's resources and the deforestation, and many people, in particular the indigenous people, were not benefiting from this. So Brazil is a good example here of the disunity and the consequences of globalization not being fair for all, and not everybody benefits from it. And that's why you could argue, this is research done by Oxfam, who say the economic inequality in Brazil has reached extreme levels, despite it being one of the largest economies in the world, and it's made great progress on its GDP. Its inequality and poverty is just unbelievable. Some of the figures here, which are just lovely to kind of, not lovely in a positive way, but lovely in a way that they exemplify the issue here, which is extreme inequality breeds conflict, violence, and instability. All Brazilians, regardless of social class or race, are affected by the inequality crisis. This is what unites us. Some of the numbers at the bottom there: 75 years at the current rate, inequality is decreasing in Brazil. It will take the country 75 years to reach United Kingdom's current level of income equality, and about 60 to meet Spanish standards. It's 35 years behind Uruguay and 30 behind Argentina. Now, it is worth adding, and I'll come to this in a second though, Brazil, if you ever go to Rio in particular, has the most amazing restaurants, bars, tourist attractions, all very developed, all very clean, amazing hotels. But remember, it's that extreme inequality, the haves and the have-nots, that is the kind of consequence of not everyone benefiting from globalization here. 19 years in Brazil, someone earning the minimum monthly wage would have to work 19 years to make the same money a Brazilian from the richest 0.1% of the population makes in 1 month. Wow. 28 million, Brazil has lifted 28 million out of poverty in the last 15 years, reducing poverty to less than 10% of the population. But the rich continue to benefit the most. Between 2001 and 2015, the richest 10% accounted for 61% of economic growth. Essentially, it's the richest are becoming even more rich. And there is another Oxfam stat there. Brazil's 6 richest men have the same wealth as the poorest 50% of the population, around 100 million people. 6 men have the same wealth as 100 million. That's in one country. The gender, so the disunity, the consequences, of Brazilian women. There's some really good women's rights groups as well in Brazil, and they are very aware that at current progress, Brazilian women will close the wage gap in 2047. Black Brazilians will earn the same as whites in 2089, and Brazil is decades away from wage equality. So again, you can see why that not everyone is benefiting here. 36 years of Brazil's six richest men pooled their wealth and spent 1 million Brazilian reals a day, around 319,000. It would take them 36 years to spend all their money. Meanwhile, 16 million Brazilians live below the poverty line. I think that makes the point that there is real inequality, unfair tax system, insufficient investments in social policies to allow everyone to benefit from the globalization that's been happening. Another update in 2023. So I'm really giving you the wow top level stuff here. And the current Lula administration withdrew. This is interesting. Withdrew a bill the Bolsonaro administration introduced to allow mining and other commercial activities in indigenous territories, and revoked policies facilitating encroachment. The government resumed titling of indigenous lands. So again, the argument here is, this is from Human Rights Watch, is that Lula is empowering the indigenous leaders. So maybe you could argue that there is an attempt to decrease the disunity. However, maybe I'm masking some of the other issues that are going on, and maybe that's just what the Western media and the human rights organizations are getting, when reality is, this really is just happened over the last few days. Elon Musk of X, formerly known as Twitter, having an all-out battle with Brazil. And apparently he said, Elon Musk says, Brazil are asking for censorship that no other country currently has. So there's real concerns about Lula trying to keep and hold on to the grip of power that he has in Brazil at the moment by effectively asking for access to DMs, private messages of all the social networks, asked to close and block certain profiles, particularly those that were anti the Lula administration. And Elon Musk effectively has said, we are lifting all restrictions. This judge has applied massive fines, threatened to arrest our employees, and cut off access to X in Brazil. As a result, we will probably lose all revenue in Brazil and have to shut down our own office there. But principles matter more than profit. There's Elon Musk standing up to this really strict censorship and lack of privacy when it comes to being able to see what you want in Brazil at the moment. So there's real concerns there that the disunity has been squashed by this current Lula administration, of which there is a huge amount. The Western media seem to prefer Lula than Bolsonaro, but there is definitely disunity and serious issues going on. Now, moving on to an example that you've already used. So the spec there asks us to think about, and I think this covers this very well, and it's content you will have already learned, which is it's BRICS and other emerging nations. So I think, the Mint countries, and Nigeria being one of the mints, I think that's a good example that you've already learned, which is, how TNCs, again, through globalization, are exploiting the weak and the poor governance in the Niger Delta and the Ogoni lands, which is to the detriment of indigenous people. So again, the disunity that we know, the rising up of the Ogoni people against Shell. This is an example that I taught you back in the globalization, so you can refer to your notes on that, or maybe you just want to recap yourself here. 75% of the Nigerian economy comes from the oil revenue. Half of that's from Shell. So you can see it's very important to the government. However, the Ogoni people have ended up having their fishing lands poisoned and ruined. No fresh or healthy running water, no electricity. And you remember the Ken Saro-Wiwa story, where effectively the Nigerian government, or I should say the army, effectively killed the Ogoni, a number of the Ogoni people, including the organizer of the movement for the survivor of the Ogoni people, Mosop, which was Ken Saro-Wiwa. Now, an update on that is Buhari, the current leader of Nigeria, pledged to pardon Saro-Wiwa. However, he's not done that yet. And I did read an article today in 2024 that said it's hard to pardon someone when he didn't actually commit a crime, which is interesting. Very interesting. What about the other BRICS? Going back to, remember, if we think of what we're looking at here, and I know I'm flicking by some slides here, we're thinking about the kind of rising tensions and disunity in emerging nations. Can we think about South Africa? I'm giving you so many examples here. It's fantastic. So there you go. You've got Brazil so far. Yes, tick. You've got some 2024 stuff there. Tick. We've just talked about the Ogoni. Nigeria is another example. Shell linking it with TNCs. Not everyone benefits from that. Tick. You've got the 2022 update. Actually, there is a coming round to understanding that maybe the Ogoni people weren't treated well in the 90s and noughties. And then we can give another example of South Africa. And again, globalization has helped South Africa, become very developed African nation. Yes, it's moved into global markets. It has also challenged the SAPs. It's got high levels of foreign direct investment. It's got lots of in-migration from all over Africa and all over the world with overseas business. So yeah, South Africans, many of them have gained, but again, huge inequality between different ethnic groups. And if you look at the graphs on the right-hand side, you can actually see again, what we have is increasing inequality between different ethnic groups. Depending on your ethnicity, we can see, if you look, it's not that easy to see, but you can see the kind of yellow bit where Mandela was imprisoned. That was the time that he was imprisoned. Many people talk about the great man that he was, and yes, the great role that he played in the country. But look at the rand per person, particularly in the 1990s onwards. Yes, there's been a general increase, but look at the increase for Black. That's where it's a little bit shocking that there still seems to be not every ethnic group is benefiting. And then if you look down on figure 2, you can see the population by ethnic group. And again, significant majority in the millions who are Black, but they are not gaining from this wider access to global markets. It seems to be the white in South Africa seem to be getting wealthier and wealthier. So you can see disunity, rising tension, rising political tensions, because again, there seems to be rampant inequality as a result of the processes that have been going on. Political tensions as well, causing disunity. An interesting example, and I'm trying to give you again another 2 country examples here. It's probably more than you need, to be honest, but you could make a lovely question out of this now because I'm giving you so many different country examples. As always, teach to the top. Feel free to pause and obviously extract notes from this, but China, increasingly dominant on the world stage. We know that. We know the Belt and Road. Again, even use that type of language. But the politics of China are showing signs of kind of being capitalist. Maybe that's going to start to hinder their overall national identity. Does that upset people? Does that maybe is there potential for power struggles in the future? We know there's censorship issues there. But maybe this move away from communist principles could start causing more political tension and disunity. And then, as always, give that current wow in globalization, in superpowers, in migration identity sovereignty. Talk about Russia, Ukraine. It features so many, and I know lots of you have been doing essays that have included it, but it's very much showing you when this spec was made, you're now talking about content that links with the spec. So yeah, the war with Ukraine since February 2022, causing tensions and disunity. I would even throw in the idea that the recent support, March 24, for Navalny, as he was being buried, he was very strong opposition to Alexei Navalny, strong opposition to Putin. Large crowds meeting in Moscow, not happy with the way that Russia has went since this conflict started. Big, issues with connections with the world, bank accounts frozen for the wealthy people, many of them not involved with Putin. But yeah, Russia will be free, Russia without Putin. Large crowds chanting at the Navalny funeral. That is tensions and disunity, because of the way people will see it. It is political tensions, isn't it? Because Navalny being an opposition for Putin, and Putin won his election again this year by making sure there was no opposition. And then if you really want what's going on right now, and this is 2 hours ago, I'm recording this on Thursday the 11th of April 2024, and this was 2 hours ago. Trung My Lan, the Vietnamese billionaire, has just been sentenced to death for a $44 billion fraud. She effectively has been involved in one of the greatest banking frauds ever the world has ever seen. She's 67, property developer. But the important bit for this spec, if you look up the top, that bit that I've put the arrow next to, is that the current leader believes that popular anger over corruption, that is political tension. Think what I was talking about there. There are significant political tensions causing disunity. Vietnam worried about the untamed corruption that exists in their country. They've said it's causing an existential threat to the Communist Party's monopoly on power. And this has been going on since 2016, trying to stop the corruption that's going on in the country. Now, that is, again, disunity. And they're making a very powerful message here by sentencing Trung My Lan to death for her $44 billion fraud. Now, that is as current as it gets. So, let's run through the examples. I've gave you a little example of Vietnam there and how corruption and political tensions are worrying the country to the point where they're making a real big stance now on stopping corruption in the country to keep disunity and keep the Communist Party's monopoly on power. Vietnam, 1. China, 2. Russia, 3. South Africa, 4. Nigeria, 5. Brazil, 6. I mean, that is incredible range of rising tensions in emerging nations. So, uneven distribution, globalization leading to disunity along ethnic or regional lines. Fantastic. Brazil, brilliant. Do use that. Nigeria, again, remember ethnic and regional lines. So, it's quite good because you can talk about the Ogoni people as a particular ethnic group. Regional lines, they have their own lands in the Niger Delta, so it's a good example. South Africa is very good because it's that kind of black-white inequality in earnings. China's good because there's a political tension there because of the political organization of the country. Russia, we can talk about current tensions because of the conflict and disunity. And then Vietnam, just your very much 2024, boom, 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 wow, example there. Now, often when the state doesn't have power, because the role of government does vary from countries, and we've just been talking about Russia there, very authoritarian, Putin very strict, Saudi Arabia, very strict as well. And then we've got things like the UK and the US that are very democratic, and there's lots of balances. And if you think of the UK, the Commons, it's very hard to pass certain new laws or things. It's got to be voted through. But often, sometimes disunity, and often at the highest and most saddest level, is that people don't care about their national identity. Maybe they show greater allegiance to their family, their tribe, or their religion, and that can lead to a failed state. Now, this is important. This is the third part there of the spec point, which is we do need to understand what we mean by failed states. And maybe that's because there is no, and I think the argument is Disunity is that much that people don't align themselves with the state. And what can often happen is, the government's weak or doesn't exist. Maybe there's a very small political elite or lack of foreign investment. Effectively, the government breaks down. There's loss of control over territory, lack of dominance. Military and army is not strong anymore. Maybe there's rival groups fighting for power, civil war. There's no decision-making process going on. I always remember the textbook has that example from the early 90s. For about a decade, Somalia never had waste collection. I mean, imagine that. The breakdown of authority and public services just goes. The government is no longer providing public services. A decade without litter collection, that would just be incredible. Inability to interact with other states because you're kind of not recognized as being in control of your own country. That represents, all these things represent a government that's broken down and is what we would refer to as a failed state. So often, if disunity and the kind of consequences of that are that bad, we may well really go down into a pretty sad state of affairs if the role of the government has got to a point where it's just broken down. That's what we would refer to as a failed state. Now, apologies, this appears to be upside down, but feel free to pause it and turn it round. But effectively, one example, going back to the early kind of 2010s, and I'm thinking precisely 2011, we had a civil war in Syria, and there was just a complete breakdown in the country. However, effectively, the Assad regime did not step down and kept fighting, and we're fighting its own people, and we're refusing to break down. And Bashar al-Assad was just not going to give up at all. But that's a good example of the country then kind of divided itself ethnically. There was ongoing conflict. What often leads to, and I mentioned it earlier too, is that it leads to the rise of groups that you don't want in your country. Terrorists and terrorist organizations take advantage of a failed state because they see it as an opportunity. And that's where, whether you want to talk about Syria or Somalia, that I'm going to talk about in a second, the biggest issue is, even when your neighboring countries, like in 2006, Ethiopia and the African Union tried to help Somalia, a failed state that I mentioned earlier, just collapsed into anarchy in 1991. And it's just been a few decades now of a very, very challenging Somalia. But effectively, there was just this rise of horrible terrorists and Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab effectively assisted in Somalia disintegrating into trouble. And if we look at 2024, this is the latest update I've got for you here, is that still there is a government at the moment, but still significant tensions going on, political violence, fatalities linked to terrorism. If you see down the bottom there's a number of Al-Shabaab related terrorist events. And then this is where we are in 2024 with Al-Shabaab again regaining some of its lost territories. There's some elections coming up at the moment. And this is the absolute latest. This is like what's going on now. And they are trying to hold these elections. But as always, this sentence here I thought was great. These political turbulences threaten the unity of the coalition supporting the counterinsurgency operation against Al-Shabaab in these states due to sub-clan, remember, different ethnic groups, disputes and power-sharing grievances. Al-Shabaab has taken advantage of these tensions to regroup, mounting offensive in several towns in the Galamundug state. So again, the reason why I'm showing you this is just to say we're now in 2024. Somalia's been a failed state since 1991. Yes, it's had functioning governments in recent years, or at least attempts to have functioning governments. But as you can see, there is still sub-clan disputes, power sharing in different states, and indeed Al-Shabaab taking control of areas again and again. So it's really important that when you're thinking disunity, when a government is not controlling the country effectively, the consequence of disunity at the worst case here, we've talked about separatist movements, we've talked about tensions with different ethnic groups and inequality rising based on your ethnicity and color. But now we're talking about an all-out failed state where actually terrorism begins to attempt to take control of certain regions. So it's been a very fast and detailed session here, going through these three areas. And again, I've gave you more examples than what you actually need for all of these areas. You'll probably notice 8B.12 Part A says Catalonia or Scotland. And I have done both of them for you, which is great. I've talked about Syria and Somalia there. The spec says Somalia as an example of a failed state. So lots of examples there. The Part B, significant political tensions in BRICS and other emerging nations. I gave you about 6 examples there. So you've got a real detailed set of notes for this final section of the course. So what's the question you could be asked on this then? Remember, 8 marks, straight up AO1. Explain, get straight to it. Let's get down business. Explain. You do not need to define what we mean by a failed state, define what we mean by an independence movement or a nationalist movement or separatism. We don't need to define that. When you explain, you get straight into it. It says the possible causes of disunity within developed and emerging nations. So that's why you need that kind of Spain, Catalonia, United Kingdom, Scotland example with nationalist movements. You're going to have to talk about that. AO1, just talk about it. Disunity's led to that. there you go, tick. Then you could talk about many of those emerging nations that I spoke about there. I gave you 6 different examples. You obviously don't need to use all 6. And I have said refer briefly to examples in an 8-mark AO1 style question like this. You are explaining the kind of factors that have caused disunity, but you're not going into case study dumping. Briefly, it's the exemplification is e.g. Catalonia, e.g. Spain, e.g. Brazil, which you can see why I've gave you lots and lots of examples, probably too much, but you never know. If this was a bigger style question or a 20 marker for a much more broad section on EQ4, you could absolutely bring in lots of these wonderful examples. And I'm sure you've got probably some of the best up-to-date 2024 notes on this section now. So that, yeah, I mean, that is explain the possible causes. If it's an 8 mark, I'd try and give 4 different points and examples there. You've got 6 for the BRICS, you've got the Catalonia and the Spain example, then you've got failed state. That is the kind of weak government causes disunity leading to failed states. Foreign investment pulls out. Countries and TNCs don't want to be in a failed state. It's just far too risky to invest in a failed state. And maybe often the political elite, the wealthy political elite, go into exile and leave the country, which doesn't help. But it's the wider population. It's those kind of people at the bottom, like I said with the Brazil example, with the South Africa example, and indeed with Somalia and Syria too. It's those who are left, the poorest, the people at the very bottom, who are sadly the ones who are the people on the receiving end. And if you think about the bombings in Syria or indeed Ukraine at the moment. It's disunity can often affect people, which again, if it's more of a 20 marker and a kind of broad evaluate question, talking about those that are most affected, the consequences of disunity affects those that are the poorest, the inequality, the unequal nature of it leads to people at the bottom suffering. So consider if the factors are similar or different, are similar in different types of countries. So maybe you could talk about, well, actually in Brazil, there is some similarity in the factors that cause disunity as South Africa. Maybe you could bring in a little bit of your colonization knowledge there with Portugal, with the Brazil example, and South Africa. You can obviously talk about the tensions there as well between white and black. You can see how almost your knowledge at this point can be much more broad than just the slides that I've gave you here. And as I've always said, keep drawing on all your examples, but you'll notice 8B.11 and 8B.12 do draw on content that you have looked at in globalization and superpowers. So feel free to go ahead, and you can indeed do that 8 marker. I think it's a nice AO1 knowledge question to do. I think you need 4 different points, well developed. 3 if they were, I think I would stick to 4. 3 is sometimes risky, but 3 if you were really giving the kind of contrast between different countries, within the end of your paragraph or something, to really show that kind of developed explanation. But if not, I think 4 is still going to be very good and get you the marks. The interesting point now is this is the end. Content is completely finished. I hope that you've enjoyed this session. I've really put a 2024 twist on it, and I've enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed the kind of current stuff in Brazil, current stuff in Ukraine, Russia, content, the Vietnamese death sentence for the property developer. Wow, it's all great. Geography, isn't it? Geography is going on now. Try in your final exam to give those 2024 updates. From me, Mr. C, as always, it's been an incredible pleasure. I've enjoyed going through this last section. Take care and ciao, ciao, ciao. Bye-bye, 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 bye-bye.